Good morning. It is Bible study time again, and here we are at Calvary Baptist Church. And we've been talking about mentors and being a mentor and investing in other people's lives. And so we looked first of all at the example of Moses and his father-in-law Jethro, how Jethro mentored Moses and helped him along the way. We looked at then how Moses helped mentor Joshua as their time in the wilderness was coming to an end and they were ready to go into the promised land. And Moses wasn't allowed to do that. Moses died on the mountain. And then we looked at last week Eli and Samuel and how the high priest, even though he wasn't a great guy, he was a great mentor to Samuel, and God used that relationship in him. Today we're going to look at maybe a relationship, a pair that you might not put together as mentorship. But I'm kind of glad we did, because we don't often talk about this example in this story in Scripture. And that's the story of Mordecai and Queen Esther. Mordecai was her cousin. Their fathers were brothers, and we don't know if he had a wife. We don't know if he had a family. We don't know anything about him. We're not told in the story. In that book of the Old Testament, the book of Esther. But we do know that she was a cousin. She was quite a bit younger. And when her parents died for whatever reason, Mordecai took her in, and he helped to raise her. And so he had an accountability for her. So it's a good story. The whole story of the book is a really good story. And a couple of things to note about the book of Esther. First thing is that it's the only book in the Scripture where the name of God is not mentioned. God is alluded to hundreds of times, and maybe not hundreds, but several. And they talk about fasting and praying. Well, why are you doing that? Well, because there is a supreme being. There is a superior that oversees things, and so they understand, because they're Jewish, Yahweh God. Just because they didn't mention him doesn't mean they're not holding truth to him. And so I think that's a good thing. But the other thing is, it's only one of two books in the Scripture that have a woman's name, the book of Ruth and the book of Esther. Every other book either has a author's name, or it has a name because of its purpose, or it's written to a certain group of people, or it's written in a certain time frame, a historical type book. So these two books have those names on them, and Ruth we can kind of understand, because the book of Ruth is the story of really a descendant of the Messiah. And so we kind of can see that, why that might be given to her. The book of Esther, a similar situation, whereas she was a part of the story of really the salvation or the redemption of the Israelite people as they were in Babylonian captivity. So as we'll see as we read through this. So just a little background about this book. They're in Persia. The Persian king, King Ahasuerus, or you might know him as Xerxes, he's sometimes called. He reigned from 486 to 464 BC. And his empire was rather large. It extended from what we would call India to now Ethiopia. Cush is the land of Ethiopia. So he disposed of his queen legally, because he was having a banquet and she refused to appear, and so he decided he needed a new queen who was going to support him. He hadn't been a ruler very long, and so he kind of needed someone to stand by his side, or someone to be faithful and a loyal example. So they decided maybe they should search the area and find him a new queen. Well, so they went out and they searched it all over, and they found some of the best looking gals in the land, and that even included the land or the parts of the kingdom where the Jewish people had been deported and where they lived. And so here they came up with Esther. Esther, her name, she would have been called, let me get the right name here, Hadassah. There we go, Hadassah. And thanks, Aaron. And so she was one that was chosen. They took them in, and she found favor with. There was a eunuch who helped them in the process to get ready. You know, they gave them so many days to kind of make themselves beautiful. They got them as attractive as they could, and as attractive as they could, and then they let the king view them, and just the natural beauty as well as the personality, the character of Esther stood out, and so she was a shoo-in. You know, she was an obvious choice to be queen. So that's kind of where we begin in this part of Esther chapter 2. So Esther was chosen to be that. So we start even before that, where we talk about Mordecai and who he was and how he had influenced her because he had at least taken her in and raised her as his own daughter. We begin in Esther chapter 2, verse 5. It says, in the fortress of Susa. Susa was a town, Persian city. The kingdom had kind of been divided up into three capitals by the time that they had gotten to this point in their history. Cyrus the Great, who lived who reigned from 559 to 530 BC, he had made Susa, Ecbatana, and Babylon his co-capital cities, and so Susa was one of the places where they were, and that's where King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, was, where he'd kind of set up his throne to be. So it says, in the fortress of Susa, there's a Jewish man named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. So it just gives him his heritage, and we see that he was the son of these people. If you trace back, then you realize that out of that, it was his ancestors who had been part of those young men who had been deported back in whenever that was, 612, 613, when Daniel had been taken out of, and others like him had been taken out of Babylon. And so that's who Mordecai was. It says in verse 6, Kish had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with other captives when Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took King Jeconiah and Judah into exile. Jeconiah of Judah. Jeconiah was son of Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim, and he kind of self-proclaimed himself to be the ruler. Some would say he was the last king of Israel, or the southern kingdom. I don't even know, because he only reigned about 3 months, and when his father died, it was like, well, I'm kind of next in line. I ought to be the king. And so he kind of self-appointed himself to be over things. So he would be known as Jehoiachin. And so he really was king. He really wasn't king. Sometimes it took months for them to declare a king. And so he just kind of stepped into the role. And that's why some scholars say, well, he really wasn't a king. We can't really count him as a king. But okay, I don't have a problem with that. So then it says in verse 7, Mordecai was the legal guardian of his cousin Hadassah, that is Esther, because she had no father or mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was extremely good looking. You know, I make sure you know that part. She was good looking. She was rather attractive. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. So there you kind of have some background out of what had happened. I guess it would have been 598 when Jeconiah or Jehoiakim Jehoiachin actually became king. And so he was a part of that, of those deportations where they took people out. It wouldn't have been until 587, 586 that Jerusalem actually fell. And so anyway, Chin, we always called him Chin. There was Kim was his dad, and Chin, Jehoiachin. He was imprisoned the whole time he was there, but they took him out, deported him out, and he was able to at least be in or to keep his title. So he, even though he was kind of a self-appointed king, he was honored somewhat as a king, even though he was imprisoned. So Kish was an ancestor. So it means because of the generational lines, Mordecai was probably born in Persia. That's why he would have the name Mordecai. It's ironically a derivative of the Babylonian god Marduk, Mordecai. Marduk means little man. Marduk, statues and things of Marduk that they erected, that they made. Marduk wasn't a very big god. He was little. They always had little statues and things of Marduk, if I remember correctly. I'm just pulling that out of the top of my head there, folks, so don't hold me to it. But anyway, Marduk was, but yet he was a very important god to the Babylonians. So he because of who he was and because of the lineage that it lists here, you understand while he may have been born in Persia, he was actually a Israelite. He was a Jew. He was a Jewish person. And that term Jew, or that term Jewish, is really one of the earliest places that this is used in the Old Testament, where that term becomes used. And it wasn't just, early on, they kind of used that term to represent the tribe of Judah. But now at this point, it's actually representative of all Jewish people. So it was the Hebrews, or in the Arabic, the Hapiru people. He was a part of that group, of that nationality. So another thing about this, he had adopted her as his own daughter. She was a cousin. The adoption rules in the ancient world, we don't know a lot about them, especially biblically. We just aren't really told a lot about adoption. It's hard to cover. It's hard to know. We can kind of speculate some things, and we can learn some things from actions or how they did things. It was a common thing in the ancient world. Adoption was. Oftentimes people took in family members or took in orphans and things off the street, or out of the community, just to help raise them, to do whatever. Very common, very noble thing for people to do. And so we see a little bit about the character of Mordecai. So what can we learn here? Well, our influence needs to be in the community, doesn't it? We need to have a good reputation. We need to be stand-up kind of people, not only in the community, but also in our family. And so he had done that within his family. What a great guy. We've talked about how good looking she was. I don't know how to compare that, but she must have been, because she was the king's choice when he saw her. And it's interesting how the eunuch that was overseeing these women, he noticed that. He recognized that in her as well. It tells us that he gave her 7 servants to make sure that she was the best she could be. So, and some have speculated, well, was that because she was a Jew and he wanted her to learn past that, so she would be more balanced, more rounded in her, the way she carried herself, so that the king wouldn't look at her and say, well, I don't want her, she's a Jew. She's good looking, but boy, I don't want her. We don't know. We don't know why he assigned more to her, other than the fact that he had favor with her, or she had favor with him, rather, and of course, favor with God. And he really saw great potential in her. So therefore, he put extra women, extra servants on her to make sure that she was her best when she appeared before the king. Um, Mordecai, if he had not stepped in and adopted her, where would she be? What kind of thing would happen to her? We don't know, do we? So then we jump over from chapter 2 over to chapter 4. And a lot has happened in that time. Chapter 3 is actually 5 years later from chapter 2. That means that she's been queen for quite a while. It says it's the 7th year of the king's reign in chapter 3, verse 7. So what has happened is, as people have progressed, they moved up. The king has appointed a man named Haman, which the name Haman means magnificent. So Haman is the head of his nobility. So he's like the second in control of things. So when they're inaugurating Haman the king orders everyone to bow down to Haman. And at least everybody who lives in Susa in that area. And Mordecai says, yeah, I only bow to one. Doesn't mention who he bows to, doesn't mention God's name, but he's, I don't bow to men. And therefore, Haman hates him because he is the one who would not bow down to him. So Haman begins to plot in his mind, how am I going to get rid of this guy? You know, he sees Mordecai as his nemesis, as his worst enemy, even though who is Mordecai? He's just, a commoner. And yet Haman is obsessed with destroying Mordecai. So then another thing happens in the scripture. Mordecai, he goes to the king's gate and he watches to see, are they taking good care of Esther? Are they treating her right? Is everything going okay for her? And so he goes. Sometimes he inquires about her, or maybe he gets to see her, or maybe she gets to come over and talk with him a little bit. And so he does that. He just makes a visit ever so often. I might have even said daily. I can't remember what it says. But he does that quite a bit. And while he's there doing this, he overhears this plot to kill Xerxes, Ahasuerus, the king. And these two guys are going to overthrow, man. There's a coup going on, and they're about to do it. And so he tells her, Esther, and she tells the king, and the king catches it, stops it, and really his kingdom is saved. And so that's a pretty big thing. Well, he doesn't want her to say where he heard it, because he still wants to be able to come and know what's going on. He doesn't. He's afraid that he might be associated with it too, and that'd be the end of him. So we then get to chapter 4, and we pick up at that story, and it says in verse 8, Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa, ordering their destruction. Oh, no. I haven't gotten that far yet. Then Haman, he's still mad. He's still angry about Mordecai. He doesn't like Mordecai. Hey, and let me just tell you, I might have left out a few things. Read the story. It's not very long. But Mordecai, he really hasn't done anything. And so Haman is still out to get him. And so that's the decree. Mordecai then makes a decree that, well, Haman's a Jew. I'm going to kill all the Jews. I'm just going to wipe them out in Susa, and then we won't have to worry about it. So that's where we pick up in verse 8. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa, ordering that's the Hebrew people, the Jewish people's destruction, so that Hathach might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and command her to approach the king, implore his favor, and plead with him personally for her people. Hathach came and repeated Mordecai's response to Esther. So Hathach was a servant that kind of was a go-between between Mordecai and Esther when he didn't see her, when she couldn't come out. He could get a message to her and do whatever. Well, this is about to happen. It's of a timely nature. And if something isn't done, now, if there's a decree that says in a year we're going to do this, or in 6 months we're going to do this, but when it's going to happen immediately, you better act if you want to stop it in any way. And so that's where he is. So it says, Esther spoke in verse 10, chapter 4. Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to tell Mordecai, all the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that one law applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard who has not been summoned. In other words, if you go to the king and you've not been summoned and the king doesn't recognize you, it's a death penalty. I mean, they're going to put you to death. Now, why would that be? Well, it's because a while back, 2 guys were going to come in and they were going to kill him. And Mordecai tipped them off, in a roundabout way, got the message to them. And so now the king, he's on guard. He's not going to let anybody come. But what he knows who they are and he knows what their business is about. So Esther says, unless the king extends the gold scepter, allowing that person to live, I've not been summoned to appear before the king for the last 30 days. In other words, it's been several years since she became queen. Yeah, he's maybe grown tired of her, or maybe just out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. Maybe he's been busy with other stuff. We don't know. But he hasn't really summoned her to come into the court with him. So her response to Mordecai was, I haven't been there. I haven't really had any contact with him in 30 days. I'm a little bit hesitant to do this. So then it says in verse 12, Esther's response was reported to Mordecai. And then verse 13, Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you're in the king's palace. And so if he hasn't summoned her for 30 days, again, out of sight, out of mind kind of thing, has he lost interest in her? Is he not quite as loyal to her as he was? Has someone else kind of caught his fancy? Or what's really going on here? So she's basically saying she was pretty risky for her to do this. And he's saying to her, look, it's gonna be your neck too, honey. You're gonna die with us because you're one of us. And so in verse 14, Mordecai says, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place. But you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And that's that's a well-quoted passage. Such a time as this. Here we are in life, and every day is such a time as this, isn't it? We do not know what every day holds, but we do know who holds the day and who holds tomorrow and who holds our lives in check when we trust in him. And so Mordecai is simply saying to her, in his providential working, here you are, this little orphan Jewish girl, and you became the queen. And here you are here. And do you ever think what purpose that might be? Perhaps it's just to help save your people. And evidently that was a good response. So what is Mordecai saying to her? He's just challenging her to help somebody. He's challenging her to do what's right, because in helping her people, she will also be helping herself. She'll also be serving herself. And what a predicament for someone to be in. And yet that's where she was. And that's not uncommon in life. Sometimes people do heroic things in order to save themselves or to save others. And so we see that in this story, don't we? Well, then we jump to our last point, and that is that you need to honor God when you're doing this. And so listen to what Esther says, beginning in chapter 4, verse 15. Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, after she's thought about it a little while. Then she sends this and says, go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. She didn't mention prayer, but prayer and fasting almost always go hand in hand. She said, don't eat or drink for 3 days, night and day. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. After that, I will go to the king, even if it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went and did everything Esther had commanded him. So what's she saying to him? She is saying, pray and fast for me. I am going to stand in the gap for you. I'm going to try to do what I can to help. And they did that. Mordecai gathered all the people of Susa and all around who were Hebrew Jewish people, and they fasted and they prayed for her. And there's several kinds of fasts. There's the fast where you can drink water but not eat. That's kind of what Jesus did in the wilderness, I believe, when Satan tempted him. There's the fast where you fast for a certain time of the day. That's what Muslims do at Ramadan. They fast through the day and then they break the fast at supper time and they eat and drink. But then there's a fast where you don't do anything. You don't eat, you don't drink. And that was a 3-day fast. That's pretty common in the scriptures. A 3-day fast. They didn't eat and they didn't drink. And Mordecai led the people to do that outside. Esther led the people inside to do that for her as well. And we are led to believe that God heard her prayer and God spared her life. The king received her. And then the king heard what was going on, because the king doesn't always know what his second in command is doing. Why would he have to tell him everything? He's just taking care of business. And in his mind, the business was, got to get rid of Mordecai. You got to wipe out the Jews. Well, there's a whole lot more to that story. But we know the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai, when the king found out how evil and deceitful he was in his heart, Haman himself was hung on his own gallows. So, well, anyway, sad story, but a good story. And so that's where we are. So mentors, we don't see a lot of discipling and whatever going on in this story, but we see the results of it, don't we? We see that not only did she know who she was, she knew that she was standing on behalf of God for her people, and she was willing to do that. Well, God bless y'all. Be a good mentor this week. Bye-bye.